Welcome to Quiet Scare, where horror doesn't scream, it whispers. Real documented experiences, carefully adapted into sleep-friendly narration. Sophisticated storytelling meets documentary truth, so the core stays intact and the atmosphere lingers. Quick note, please like and subscribe, and tap the bell for new episodes. There are no more than 3 ads in the first 15 minutes. After that, uninterrupted listening. Curated accounts, elevated with literary craft for sophisticated listeners. Sleep well and dream dark. I was 9 the summer we stayed with my grandparents. The house smelled like sun-warmed wood and detergent, and the afternoons were bright enough to show dust lines in the air. People in the neighborhood treated a bit of old folklore like any other local fact. Long ago, an old man and a small child were buried near the property. My grandparents never pressed it. It sat in the background with the way the screen door stuck or how the furnace clicked when it cooled. It was daytime when I saw him. My cousin and I were at the dining table with pencils and curled paper. She kept redrawing the same bluebird, each version darker where her hand pressed harder. From my chair, I could see down the hallway to the lower level stairs. The first few steps were in view. The turn into the basement was in shadow. A small figure rose into the light at the top of those steps. The child stood no taller than my shoulder. His clothes belonged to a different time. A pale shirt with a rounded collar and knobby buttons, wool shorts that ended neat above the knee, thick-ribbed socks. He did not blur or fade. He was as clear as the edge of the table. He stopped where the light fell and watched my cousin's pencil move. Then he turned to me. His eyes were steady and curious. His mouth lifted into a small, shy smile. I pushed my chair back and the legs squealed on the floor. He pivoted and ran along the hallway toward the bathroom. His steps were quick and quiet, arms tucked, knees lifting in a careful rhythm. I stood up and took one step after him on reflex. By the time I looked down the hall, he was already near the bathroom door. He glanced back once and gave the same brief smile. Then he was gone. No door closed. No sound followed. The bathroom door stayed slightly open. The towel on the rack didn't move, and the hallway light lay flat on the carpet again. In the kitchen, my grandmother listened while she worked a bowl of bread dough. I described the collar, the socks, and how he moved. She did not look surprised. She said people had spoken about a small child near these stairs for years, and that nothing bad had ever happened. I noted the matter-of-fact way she said it, and the way she brushed flour from her fingers. We didn't chase him or try to repeat it. After that, the lower-level steps and the long hallway felt occupied in a way I could not prove. I checked the stairs more often when the afternoon light made rectangles on the carpet. I saw only light and the nick in the banister where someone once bumped a box. A few weeks later, my grandfather asked our parish priest to bless the house. The priest walked each room with a small vial in his pocket and quiet words under his breath. He paused at the stairs and then at the bathroom door. He traced a small cross in the air and moved on. The house seemed quieter after that. We did not see the child again. I still glanced at the top step when my cousin's pencil skittered across paper, half expecting a pale shirt to slide into the light. The stairs stayed stairs, and the bathroom stayed only a bathroom with a towel that never dried right at the edge. When people asked about the story of the old man and the child, I said I saw the child once. I said he was small, dressed in that old style, and that he smiled before he ran and vanished near the bathroom. I mean it exactly. Clear collar and daytime light, quick steps down the hall, and then nothing at all. I was home from school with a fever and stretched on the living room couch, half watching a children's show while the fireplace glass held a dim copy of the room. Sunlight sat in a square on the carpet. The house was quiet enough that the TV's jingles sounded too bright. That was where I noticed it, not in the room but in the reflection. A dark figure behind the couch, hunched and swaying. The motion had a steady rhythm that matched the show's simple song. I watched the glass. No footsteps, no sound. The silhouette drifted side to side like a child copying along with the screen. I turned to check behind me. The space was empty. I looked back at the fireplace. The figure still moved in the glass. A small lean, then a return to center, keeping time with the show. I sat up and the fever made my vision tilt for a second. I decided to cut the noise and press the remote. The TV clicked off and the room went still. A second later, the front door opened. The latch gave a hollow pop and the door swung wide. I stayed on the couch, listening. A draft shaped a path down the hall and lifted the corner of the mail on the console by the entry. No one came in, no steps. After holding still long enough to count a few breaths, I stood and moved down the hall. The entry was bright from the afternoon. The door stood open to the porch. I shut it. I set the deadbolt and checked the handle to make sure it caught. Then I went window to window and confirmed the locks. I called my mom and asked if she had come home or if anyone else had a key. She said no. She kept me on the line while she contacted our neighbor to check from outside. No one was there. Nothing else moved. When my mom and sister returned later, I walked them through it. The living room was back to normal. The fireplace glass only returned my face and the pale rectangle of the window. My mom looked at the latch and said the weather sometimes shifts doors open. I nodded. I didn't have better language for the swaying reflection or the timing of the door. The memory stayed with me. Reflection, steady movement, door opening into an empty entry. Years later, I told a friend who grew up a few streets over. He asked which room and which way the couch had faced, then said our place sat near the old brick building at the corner that used to be the town school. He said people in the area sometimes talked about a child's spirit seen around those blocks. The details in those stories were simple. It copied what it saw on televisions. It swayed with songs. It lingered at doorways longer than made sense. He added that early records named a child who died when the building served as a schoolhouse. The stories always returned to the same behavior, watching, imitating, then pausing at a threshold. I didn't take that as proof. It gave the memory a frame that fit the facts I had. I had watched a swaying shape in glass while a children's show ran. The front door had opened by itself a moment after I turned the TV off. We checked. No one had entered. No one had left. The order of events never changed when I replayed it. If there was a child in my living room that day, it didn't try to harm me. It followed the rhythm, practiced the steps, and then when the noise cut and the entry cleared, left through the door into the plain bright afternoon. I was 16 and not good at camping. I had spent more time in the sporting goods aisle than in actual woods. My cousin Mark invited me to an overnight outside Morgantown, up a steep hill past a service road to a radio tower. He called it beginner friendly. We hiked in at dusk with a cheap headlamp, 2 overstuffed backpacks, and a plan that was instant noodles and hope. The campsite sat on a flat knob at the top of a long drop. The hill fell away fast on 3 sides toward a gully. Porch lights showed far off, if I stepped to the edge and leaned. I did that and told myself there were real beds in that direction. I focused on how not to end up rolling toward them in the dark. I clipped tent poles and pretended I didn't have the manual in my pocket. I found a level patch and moved 1 rock like it mattered. I tied a food bag in a tree. It wasn't a perfect bear hang, but it was something. I had also packed a whistle because a video told me to, which I lost within 10 minutes, and decided not to mention. We ate noodles and watched the sky go from violet to black. No moon. The tower's red light blinked behind the tray line to the west. The air turned colder. Our small fire lit a circle the size of a rug. We talked about normal things and then put the fire out. The tent amplified every shift and zipper. Mark went to sleep. I lay there and stared into the dark, and counted the times my headlamp had slipped down over my eyes on the hike. A sound came from the steep side. It was not a howl or an animal call. It was a long rip, like tape pulled off a box. Then a pause. Then another steady pull. The sound came from higher than ground level. It sat up and to the right, 8 to 10 feet off the slope, like the source hung in the air. I stayed still and ran through options. Owl, branch rub, a tarp somewhere. None of them fit the rhythm or the pitch. The sound repeated, same length, same spacing. It moved across the drop without lifting or dipping with the terrain. It held a constant height while the ground fell away. Every part of me went tight. My breathing shortened. I reached over and touched Mark's shoulder. He woke fast. We both went quiet. The sound drew another strip out of the night. He said it wasn't an animal and left it there. He had camped here before and knew the usual noises. We stopped talking. I knew we were done with jokes for the night. A heavy step hit below. The ground under the tent took it. Not a rumble. A single deep impact. Then another. The spacing was even. The vibrations came up through the dirt into my knees. Each one confirmed mass and motion. We opened the tent carefully and pushed our heads out. The hill fell away into black. The trees made a jagged line. We held the headlamp off. We let our eyes adjust and listen. The tearing sound kept its height and path, a line in space ignoring the slope. It should have dropped as it passed over lower ground. It did not. I clicked the headlamp on and swept the slope. The beam showed branches, leaf undersides, and empty air. Nothing stood where a thing would stand to make that sound at that height. The rip stopped the instant light hit that patch. The silence that followed was plain and heavy. We waited and counted on our breathing. The steps kept coming. 1, 2, 3. Same distance between dust, lifted in the beam and settled. I asked in a low voice if we should call someone. Mark shook his head. We had nothing clear to report and no one to call. Who could do anything on a dark hill this late? We kept the light low. The tape rip resumed and tracked parallel to the edge of our clearing. It sat 8 to 10 feet above a spot that was 30 feet down the slope while staying level with us. I could point to it in the air. It moved like the hillside was a level hallway. The geometry made it wrong. That was the piece that set the danger in my body. The world had a rule and it snapped here. Another step ran through the hill and up into my ankles. I lowered the beam to keep the light from that path. The cone shook. The rip held its length. The adhesive lift and the small pitch change at the end, and it advanced to the edge of our clearing and stopped. We did not speak. We did not move. My calf muscles trembled from holding still. A final impact hit strong enough to puff dirt into the tent wall behind us. I turned the light off. The ripping sound cut mid-pull. The quiet after had no insects and no rustles. The tower's red blink timed out behind the trees. The only regular thing. My whistle was somewhere in the leaves or in the tent, and I knew I would not use it. Any extra noise felt like crossing a line. We stayed crouched with the tent at our backs until the next sound came. The ripping resumed farther down the slope, still fixed at that impossible height. The steps spaced out and grew lighter. The hill took less of the weight as it moved away. The line in the air ran past the trees and lost itself in the distance. Then even the guess of a position was gone. We stayed where we were until our knees hurt. We didn't take out our phones. We didn't check the time. When we finally zipped the tent closed, the nylon teeth sliding together sounded loud in the small space. We lay down and watched the faint smears of light on the roof from earlier. The night held. When I drifted, I woke to the tent fabric moving and waited for the rip or the step. Neither returned. Dawn came as a gray light and a rush of birds. Their chatter filled in what had been missing. We packed without much talk. We avoided the slope's edge. We coiled and shook and tucked gear like a checklist we knew well. On the hike down, my legs felt weak and each loose rock got a slow test before I put weight on it. We looked for tracks and did not find any. The ground was too steep and covered to hold a clear print. Back on the service road, I checked the time and typed 2 words into my notes app. I marked that the height stayed constant. It was the only accurate phrase I had. I did not know why the sound held level while the land dropped. I did not know what made the steps that shook dirt into our tent. I did not know why the sound stopped when light hit that patch and started again when it moved. We got coffee near High Street before I went home. The barista asked if we were out early. I said we camped and left it there. It didn't need a longer report for me at that counter. I have not camped on a hilltop since. I avoid ridges and knobs where the land falls away on 3 sides. If I go out at night, I choose flats where ground and sound line up. When friends ask why, I tell them I sleep better in low places and change the subject. I do not go back to the Tower Road. I do not step to the edge to look for porch lights. I am not trying to hear that line in the air again. I live in a 1-story house in Greeley, Colorado. I sell insurance. My wife Anna teaches 2nd grade. Our son Jonah is 7. We share a wall with his room. At night, the hallway light leaves a thin bar under his door. That is the house. The first night I woke to his voice through the wall. It wasn't a sleepy mumble. It was steady and clear, like a person on a call. He paused, listened to something I couldn't hear, then answered in full sentences. I lay still and waited for it to turn into a dream. It didn't. The baby monitor sat on my nightstand. We still kept it for sound. The red light showed power. I told myself I would finally replace its batteries soon, then got up and crossed the hall. I opened his door a few inches. Jonah lay on his back with his eyes closed and his mouth slightly open, one arm straight out. He spoke again. He said he was okay, that he could hear now. He paused like he was listening, then answered again. The words came out calm and shaped. I stepped over the threshold. His voice stopped at once. The air in the room was cool on my forearms and warm near the bed. I backed up to the doorway. His voice started again, quiet and composed. I stepped in. It cut off mid-breath. I tested that line twice and then stopped. I didn't want to push it. I went back to bed and watched the monitor light. I planned to call the pediatrician in the morning and ask how coherent sleep talking can be. I also told myself I'd find the direct number so I didn't get stuck in the main menu again. In the kitchen, Jonah asked for cereal and ate with his hair sticking up. He said he slept fine and wanted to bring his glow-in-the-dark dinosaur to school. He had no memory of any talking. He shrugged and moved on to a Lego. I told Anna what I heard. She said kids talk in their sleep, then listened while I explained the on-off switch at his doorway. She stopped smiling at that and said we could move him to our room if it continued. At lunch, I looked up sleep talking and read that kids can speak in full sentences and should be left to sleep if they're safe. I called the pediatrician's office. The nurse said the same. I asked her to email their general sleep guide again, because I hadn't saved it the first time. Just after midnight on the second night, I woke to small footsteps on the hallway scene. Jonah didn't stop at the bathroom. Our door was mostly closed. He pushed it, and the latch touched the strike and popped. He walked in and came to my side of the bed. His eyes were open a little, but not focused. He stood very close and gave a simple rule about not opening the door yet. His tone was flat and calm. He turned his head toward the hallway. I looked past him at the gap near the frame. The air there quivered once. It was a fast ripple where the door met the dark. It appeared and vanished in a blink. I couldn't connect it to a cause. It was present and then gone. I got up. He stood like he had finished his task. I guided him back to his room, said his name once, and watched him lie down. He pulled the sheet up, closed his eyes, and his breathing settled. The talking didn't return. I waited in the doorway and then went back to bed. Sleep didn't come. I counted to steady my heart and then stopped counting because it wasn't helping. In the morning, he talked about a field trip to Centennial Village and asked again about the dinosaur. He had no memory of coming into our room. I told Anna what I saw at the door and what he had said. She told me we should move him for a few nights. We would call it temporary and simple. We would tell him we were doing a campout in our room. Before bed, I pulled his mattress onto our floor at the foot of the bed. We left our door open a hand. The hallway looked ordinary. I let him bring the dinosaur. We brushed teeth and settled in. I watched him fall asleep with one finger on the edge of his pillow. He slept through that night without talking. I woke at 4 to dense silence before the furnace came on, looked at the open door and saw nothing moving. In the morning, he asked for pancakes. We agreed he could have them if he picked up socks. He said okay. and the voice he uses when nothing about his behavior will change. We kept him in our room the next night. I called my sister in Aurora. She is a nurse and told me to write down anything unusual with dates and times. She said sleep and memory make details slippery. I started a short note in my phone with the nights and what occurred. On the third night, we tried him back in his room with a clear plan to move him if it started again. He missed his nightlight and wanted the crescent back on his wall. He fell asleep fast. The house settled. At 11:30, he started talking again. The same steady cadence as the first night. I went to his doorway and stayed on the line. The phrases were bare, fine, okay, yes, it's okay. They only meant anything if you could hear the other side. I waited for a pause and then stepped in. He stopped. I stepped back. He started. I didn't know why it matched the doorway so exactly. I didn't map it further. I told Anna in a low voice, and we lifted his mattress again. He kept talking while we slid it down the hallway. When we crossed the scene, he went silent. He stayed asleep. We set the mattress at the foot of our bed and did not speak. I lay on the floor until my breathing slowed and watched the hall. The air stayed still. In the morning, he asked for oatmeal and had no memory of the talking. I emailed his teacher that he might be tired this week. She wrote back that second grade is a marathon, not a sprint. We kept him in our room for 4 nights. He slept. We slept some. I added short notes for each night. On the 5th night, I stood in his doorway at 10 and looked over his bed, the small tray of Lego, and the drawer where socks never match. The room smelled like laundry. I watched the hallway and the thin bar of streetlight. Nothing shifted. We moved him back the next night and left our door open. He slept. We slept. I decided not to add a camera or a new monitor. The nurse had told us to let him sleep if he was safe. We let him sleep. We didn't tell him what we saw or heard. At night when I pass his doorway, I put my hand on the frame and count 2 steps into my own room. I don't open his door unless he calls my name. He hasn't called my name at night since we first moved his mattress. I don't know why the voice stopped when I crossed the line. I don't know what the brief ripple in the doorway meant. We kept him close for a week and moved him back. He sleeps in his room now. We leave the hallway light on its lowest setting. I keep one rule from that second night. If he talks like that again, I wait at the door, then move him to our room, and I do not open the door yet. I was 14 when we moved into the house, at the edge of Glenbridge Woods. The backyard dropped to a tall chain-link fence, and beyond it the trees stood close and dark. The first night the rooms echoed and the boxes were stacked to the ceiling. Later, my parents said they saw a face at the bedroom window. The top pane was too high for anyone standing on the ground. They checked the locks and blamed reflections. The yard stayed quiet. A thin, steady tone came and went outside, like breath held and released, and then the glass went still again. We learned the rules within a week. We kept the curtains closed at dusk, brought the dog in early, and stayed out of the woods. It felt like a list you follow because you cannot explain why it matters. The fence line took on weight I could feel from the kitchen sink. A month in, I started catching a shape above it. Not a face, just the top of a head, tall and tapering to a cone, rising a few inches over the chain link and then slipping back down. It came in short, patient visits. By the time I called anyone over, there was only fence and trees, and my pulse moving in my ears. The first close sound was a whistle from the property edge at dusk. I was on the patio with a friend, Tyler. 3 notes rose in a human pattern and then stopped. We held still and listened. The notes started again, closer to the fence, made with a mouth that had learned the shape of the sound but not the tune. We went inside and locked the door without arguing. The same 3 notes came once more through the glass and ended. I turned on a movie and sat where I could see the back door. After that, night meant windows latched and blinds shut. My parents added motion lights. Deer set them off, and the flood bulbs filled the yard with flat white, then shut down. The pattern in the yard did not change. Some days it waited for daylight. One afternoon in late fall, my sister and I were raking leaves when the cone-shaped top rose again over the fence. It tilted, held there, and dropped out of sight. We left the rakes where they were and stepped inside. The leaves unfurled themselves back across the grass in the wind. Our neighborhood had places kids avoided in groups. The culvert under Arbor Road, the old silo by the pasture, the thickest part of the woods at the back of our fence. No one named it with anything better than the Tall Man, or the Thing. The first person to bolt was a boy from the next street, Eli. We were supposed to meet at the trailhead to build a bike ramp from scrap plywood. He did not show. The next day, his mother said he was staying with family. He would not sleep. He would not go outside. He would not explain what he saw in the trees. They moved before summer came. The clearest sighting happened this spring. It rained every other day. Tyler and I were driving the rural road toward the gas station. The sky was a dull lid, the asphalt wet and dark. We came around a bend and passed a figure standing on the shoulder. It was far taller than any person I have stood next to, a long, narrow build inside old clothing that hung wrong. The coat seams looked stretched thin. As the car drew even, the head turned, the top tapered to a cone, the jaw ran narrow, and the face was out of register, like a picture shifted under glass. I could not fix the eyes. A breathy whistle lifted behind the closed car windows, the same 3 notes but strained and light. I pressed the accelerator, the tires chattered on the paint, and then caught. We did not speak until we were under the gas station canopy. The light there hummed, and the pump screen beat, and those were facts I could hold. At home, we adjusted to fit the house. My mother kept a chair under her window because furniture was an answer she could point to. My father installed new latches and slept better because they clicked. My sister pulled her bed away from the line of the glass and asked to sleep on my floor. When the wind hit the eaves, our dog moved quietly after dark and avoided the back door. I watched for a rhythm. The pieces held together. The whistle at the fence, the cone over the chain link, the face at the high pane, the boy who left without a story, the figure on the roadside. None of it made a finished picture. All of it changed how I moved through the rooms. I left for college and told myself I was only leaving town. The noise of the dorm covered the quiet we had learned to keep. On some nights, I caught myself starting the 3 notes and stopped before the last one. My parents sold the house 2 years later. They wanted something smaller and closer to work. We drove past once, out of habit. From the street, the fence looked thin and simple, and the trees behind it stood in the same place they had always been. I did not plan to look up anything. I did it anyway. I found old forum threads, scanned local clippings, notes from people who did not sign their names. The pattern ran back decades. People wrote about faces in high windows, human whistling where no one stood. A tall figure with a cone-shaped head at the edge of clearings and ditches, and 2-lane roads. Some mentioned old clothing. One woman wrote about her brother who would not ride through the woods and could not be pushed to tell why. A retired officer listed calls that never made it into reports. Reading those, the quiet in our house made a new kind of sense. We had lived at the border of a thing that understood edges and crossed them. People ask why we stayed as long as we did. The real answer is that there was no single break. It began as a tension. We became a family that set chairs under windows and kept our voices even after dark. The fence line stayed, and the woods pressed up to it, and we learned to move inside the space between those facts. When I drive that rural stretch now, I keep the speed steady and the windows up. I do not slow at the pasture. I do not look at the shoulder. The wind thins when the trees open, and then the road levels out and the sound in the car returns to ordinary. I do not try the 3 notes anymore. The trees stand where they stand, and the fence holds its line, and the light on the pump hums when I stop for gas, and watch the numbers climb under my hand. I woke up because the room had changed. The heater still ticked, but the air felt packed in, like the space between my bed and the wall had closed by an inch. I propped up on my elbows and saw my younger sister sitting upright. Her face turned toward the old wardrobe we kept latched, because the left door liked to drift open if you didn't set it right. She was awake in a technical sense. Her eyes were open, and she breathed steady. She looked at the wardrobe and started answering someone in a quiet, clear way that sounded like her daytime voice. She wasn't mumbling or laughing or running words together. It was a normal conversation shape delivered to a piece of furniture. The wardrobe door opened by itself. It didn't swing wide. It eased out an inch or two and stopped, then closed. Then it did it again. The hinges gave a small creak at the same point on each pass. There was no draft. The window in our shared room stuck year-round, and the vent was on the other side of the beds. I stayed still. I watched long enough to know this wasn't an accident. The door opened and closed in a measured way while my sister faced it, and the room stacked up with a pressure that made me swallow. She lay back down after a few minutes and went right on sleeping. In the morning, she had no memory of waking or talking. She ate breakfast and asked where the good cereal went, like any other day. It didn't happen nightly. It showed up twice the first week and then 3 times the next. Each time she sat up, turned to the wardrobe and answered in that same plain tone, and the door worked in that same controlled open and close. I started clocking the timing by habit. It came between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the house was quiet and the heater cycled less often. I kept a hand on my phone under the blanket the 3rd time and recorded for proof. The file was nothing but room noise. The creak didn't carry to the recording, or I didn't capture it right. Either way, I had no usable clip. Our mother believed the part about sleep and said we could move the wardrobe out if it would help. We tried to shift it once in daylight and gave up, when the base caught the floorboards and the whole cabinet pulled toward a lean. We wedged a book under the front right foot instead, and checked the latch twice at night. The latch stayed set. The door opened anyway when it wanted to, and only while my sister sat up and looked at it. By the 3rd week, I could tell it was about to start before my sister moved. The air pressed on my ears and the room light went flat like the ceiling bulb dimmed. Even if it didn't, I set the lamp to low and slept with it on to keep the geometry of the room simple. 2 twin beds, a sagging dresser, the wardrobe on the wall by the door. When it began, she turned toward the wardrobe and spoke in short, regular lines. I couldn't hear a second voice, but the timing made sense for an exchange. The door answered with its slow swing and return. I didn't know why it opened. I only knew it opened then, in that way and not for me or at any other time of day. The last night started the same. The pressure in my ears arrived, and my sister sat up and put her feet on the rug. She aligned her shoulders with the wardrobe and waited like a student taking attendance. The left door eased out. The hinge creaked at the same point. She nodded the way you nod when you understand simple instructions. I sat up. My heart rate jumped into my throat. I decided not to wait it out. I told it to stop. I didn't raise my voice. I used the same tone I would use to end an argument where someone had pushed past a line. I set a rule. It was not allowed to use my sister. It was not allowed to move anything in our room, and it would leave. I spoke the rule in one line, and then repeated the part about not using her. The door froze halfway. It did not inch forward. It did not swing back. It just stopped and held there. The latch wasn't engaged yet. The gap showed a dark strip of interior. I kept my eyes on the latch so I had a single point to watch. The room lost some of its pressure. My sister's head tilted left by a few degrees, and then she straightened and lay back down without looking at me. Her breathing shifted to the even rise and fall of sleep. The door closed. The latch seated with a clean click. I did not move for a long minute. Then I turned the lamp up to full and sat with my back against the headboard until the heater cut off. Nothing else moved. I got out of bed and pressed the latch with my thumb. It held. I checked the book under the wardrobe leg. It was still wedged tight. The activity ended that night. My sister did not sit up again to face the wardrobe. She woke each morning without any memory of the month. When I asked about dreams, she shrugged and said she didn't remember her dreams, which was true for her in general. I stopped asking. The house did not lay down flat right away. The air in the hallway felt heavier, and sound carried different. The refrigerator hum pushed through the kitchen doorway more than it should have. I could tell if my mother stood just inside my bedroom door by ear alone, and without seeing her shadow. It wasn't a new event. It was a residue from the run. I went to school and came home and made sure the lamp worked. I checked the wardrobe latch once before brushing my teeth, and once after. The click stayed crisp. On the 5th morning after I set the rule, I woke with my face turned toward the wardrobe and the room at its normal weight. The heater kicked on, and it was just heat. The latch was seated. I marked the door closed in my head, and told myself the same rule again. Because it cost nothing and took one breath, I kept that habit. If I woke and the room felt off, I paused and repeated the boundary before I moved. I didn't know what used my sister as a line. I knew that talking to it through her had stopped when told to stop, and that the door had not opened again, which was enough to hold the shape of the room the way we needed it held for sleep. It's been quiet since, but I still touch the latch at night and listen for the small click before I lie down, because it is a simple check I can make, and the house keeps that kind of check cleanest. I only agreed to stay because my friend Evan said his parents needed help keeping an ear out for his little sister. The spare mattress went on her floor under the window. The house smelled like laundry and dry cereal. The room had a built-in storage door, waist high with a thumb latch, straight ahead, closet left, bed under the window right. The hall light threw a clear stripe across the carpet. Ordinary room and an ordinary split level on the north side of Arvada. It should have been a quiet night. We played cards on the floor while his sister Maya brushed her teeth. Evan watched the storage door like he was checking the weather. He told me it shut clean, no draft. He'd kept board games back there when he was a kid. I pressed the latch once and heard it click. I put my phone on Do Not Disturb and set it on the dresser. I texted my mom that I wasn't driving home late, and she answered with a grocery list, because our family can turn any plan into errands without trying. I said I'd grab paper towels tomorrow, and that counted as my contribution to household stability. Maya climbed into bed. The nightlight made a small oval on the wall. Evan tucked the blanket. I stretched out on the spare mattress with my shoes still on. A car went by and swept the ceiling with headlights. The house settled. Normal quiet. Then Maya said a man stood in the storage unit, and he had no eyes. She said it flat, like she didn't want to make it bigger. I looked straight at the door. The latch was down. The chrome tongue sat in the strike plate. No movement. I waited for Evan to say it was a dream. He kept his voice steady and told her the door was shut. He turned the lamp on, then off, then on again, as if the brightness could make the statement hold. My job was to be extra calm mass in the room, so I told Maya we heard her and she did the right thing by saying it. The words sounded official and thin. Her eyes stayed on the storage door. Mine did too. I registered the hardware like I was memorizing a face. The latch lifted, the chrome tongue retracted with a small metal sound. The door eased open about 2 inches and stopped. No wind came through. No vibration shook the wall. Nobody touched it. The movement was simple and exact. I didn't know why it opened. I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that would change what we had just seen. Maya pulled the blanket higher and pressed herself into the mattress. She didn't cry. She looked smaller. The air felt heavier in my ears, like pressure changed. I watched the bed. The blanket on her left rose and sagged, as if a knee pushed under and put weight down and the mattress took it. The pillow slid an inch toward the left. The fabric moved in a way I know and could point to. The space next to her filled with a presence I could not see. I got to my feet. Evan was already moving. He slid his hands under Maya's arms and lifted her out of the bed. He didn't jerk. He set her on her feet and shifted her toward the door. My hands closed on my backpack straps. We stepped into the hallway. The hall light was bright and dry. The difference between that hall and that room was immediate. The temperature felt normal again. My shoulders dropped without me deciding to relax. I told Evan we should go to his parents' room. He agreed. We didn't call out. His parents were awake and stepped into the hall with the faces people wear when they hear something wrong in their house. He said we were not sleeping in there. We took blankets and made a spot on their floor. We left their door open and kept the hall light on. That became the rule for the night. Nothing else happened. No sounds from the storage door. No shift in air. No more pressure in the ears. The hours stretched and then spilled into morning. When I went back for my charger, the storage door sat open to that same 2-inch gap. The latch stood up. The room still smelled like laundry. The cartoon moons on the spare sheet were just shapes on fabric. The door did not move while I stood there. We didn't go back. Once Maya slept in the parents' room, the activity stopped. The boundary held. Later, in daylight, Evan and I stood in his sister's doorway and checked the hardware. He pressed the latch and felt the spring load. It clicked and stayed. He opened and shut it a few times. It behaved like simple hardware. We looked at it and learned nothing. We didn't push for anything more because what we needed was already clear enough. I drove home after breakfast. I bought the paper towels on the way, and my mom put them in the pantry. She asked if we slept. I said not really, and drank coffee. The day climbed into its usual shape. The brain will choose the next task, then the next. That's how you move from night to morning, when you don't have answers. I went over the order to make sure I wasn't making a stack of impressions look like proof. Maya reported a man with no eyes in the storage unit. After that, the latch lifted and the door opened by 2 inches. After that, weight displaced the blanket and shifted the pillow toward her shoulder. We left the room and moved her to the parent space. The event stopped. That sequence is the whole thing. People ask what I would have done if it kept going. I don't answer. The only decision that worked was to leave the room and keep her with her parents. I don't need it to be more than that. It is specific enough to follow next time. I have one new rule. If I do an overnight watch for a kid, I take the hallway, I keep sightlines on the doors, I check latches once, and then I stop watching them because waiting for a latch to move turns a piece of hardware into a clock that owns your breath. When I visit Evan late, I say goodnight in the hall. I don't cross that threshold. I sit downstairs in the living room and listen until the house sounds like a house again. I don't know why that night happened. I know the line we kept, and what stopped when we kept it. I used to treat my sister's color friends as kid logic that would fade with time. She assigned corners and objects their own shades. Blue stayed under the bed, green kept to the closet, red belonged outside near the street. By the time I was a teenager, those stories sat in the background like old chalk lines on the driveway, still faintly there but not something I looked at. My younger brother didn't bring it up either. We were busy with school, chores, and the usual noise of a normal house. One late fall evening, we were bagging leaves after dinner. The backyard fence backed onto an alley that opened to a quiet street. A weak streetlight across the way flickered on and off. The air had that dry metal smell the first cold nights bring. My sister stopped raking and stood very still. She didn't speak, but her posture changed from loose to braced. I set the rake down and followed her line of sight across the fence slats to the alley mouth. A tall, intensely red figure stood near the curb. The red wasn't a fabric or a light. It read like the color came from inside it. A saturated block that didn't dim under the streetlight stutter. No features were visible. It had the height and outline of a person. It did not move. Something in the center of my back tightened and held. I didn't step forward. My sister closed the space between us until our shoulders touched. My brother stopped kicking a flat soccer ball and watched us without speaking. I asked where she saw it and kept my voice level. She didn't answer. She pressed in closer. I looked again and confirmed the figure at the curb. My brother asked if I saw it. I said yes. He said the color matched the hydrant by the alley. My sister said Red had always been outside on the hydrant when she was little. I remembered her old wording about that little hat on the curb and the way we had laughed to keep it small. The figure tilted its head toward the fence line. The sensation in my back shifted to a full stop signal. I made a choice to end the yard work and get us inside. I took my sister's wrist in one hand and caught my brother's sleeve with the other. We walked. We kept to a steady pace through the gate and across the patchy grass. The sliding door stuck halfway and gave a long scrape before it opened. The kitchen light was hard and bright. Our mother turned from the sink. She scanned our faces and then the backyard. She didn't register any person in the alley or at the curb. I told her 3 details in order. We were in the yard. A tall red figure stood at the street. We needed to stay inside and close the door. She watched my sister's hands and my brother's posture and stopped asking for specifics. She called our dad. While we waited, my sister stiffened and said it was closer. I kept my eyes on the glass and put a hand against the door frame to ground myself. The air in the kitchen felt colder than normal for early evening. Our dad came home and checked the yard anyway. He walked the grass halfway to the fence and stood there, then returned without a conclusion. My mother called our parish office. She had returned to church the winter before, and Father Miguel had helped her through a different problem. He arrived with a small worn book and a shallow brass bowl. He listened to the timeline and to the detail about the hydrant at the alley mouth. He noted my sister had seen it as a child. My brother had matched it to the hydrant color, and I had just confirmed a sighting. He didn't rush outside. He touched the sliding door frame with wetted fingers and made a quick cross in the air. He scanned the kitchen corners, the hallway vent, and then the fence line. He stepped into the yard at a measured pace. He moved along the fence until he reached the point by the alley opening. He began to pray in a low voice. The words were steady and calm. He traced small crosses in the air and flicked water across the slats. The droplets beaded and ran. My shoulders dropped a fraction. My sister's breathing slowed. My brother leaned a little against our dad's side. Father Miguel paused at the section of fence nearest the hydrant. He pressed his palm flat on the top board as if setting it in place. His voice firmed. The sound in my ears changed like a pressure equalizing on a flight. The backyard temperature stayed cold but stopped feeling wrong. The streetlight stabilized for a stretch without a flicker. The space between the fence and the alley looked ordinary again. He told us the presence could be tied to place or to a fear of a place. He said we did not have to engage it. He made one quick cross for each of us and again at the doorway. He took a glass of water, set the empty glass by the sink and said he would check in later. He left us the small routine of closing the slider and turning the lock. We didn't see the red figure again that night or that winter. The hydrant collected a gum wrapper and a clipped grass edge around its base. My sister stopped waking at 3 with a rigid back. My brother told me months later that he had seen the figure once at 9 years old, seated on the hydrant with its 2 long legs reaching the curb. He kept it to himself, because he believed naming it would pull it closer. He asked if I still thought these were childhood stories. I said I saw what he saw and that it left when told to leave. He accepted that and changed the subject. Now when late evening settles and that same streetlight clicks on, I sometimes stand at the slider and look toward the alley. The hydrant is chipped and dull. The fence boards are dry and straight. I picture the 3 of us in a line, connected at the shoulders and the wet line on the wood where the water ran and then dried back into plain wood again. Just before dawn, the trees stood as dark forms against a pale sky, and the air had a steady bite that reached through my sleeves. I had my camp near a shallow stream where the water slid over stones without much noise. I was a few weeks into a slow loop through the region as a temporary resident, traveling with an indigenous guide who let me follow his route so long as I kept pace and kept quiet. I woke to the fresh smell of resin and hot bark. It wasn't a faint carry on the wind. It was close. 50 or 60 paces away, a small fire burned at the base of a cedar. The ring of stones was clean and precise. The flame sat low and steady. An elderly man in traditional clothing rested beside it with his knees up. His jacket was a heavy woven fabric in muted earth tones, and a narrow band circled his hat. Fine beadwork lined his cuffs. He watched the flame with a fixed attention that read more like a habit than a trance. My guide lay on the far side of camp under his blanket, hair loose over his shoulder, breathing slow. I stepped closer and took in the set of the stones, the careful scrape that bared the bark just enough to keep it safe. The man turned and studied me with pale brown eyes. We exchanged a few short lines that passed for greetings and measures. He asked where I was headed. I told him nowhere quickly. He asked who I walked with. I said a friend who knew the land. He told me, in plain terms, to match my steps to that friend's, to pay attention to how his feet met the ground, as much as to what he said. I pointed out the fire and asked if he had built it. He said, "You give a thing a place and it holds itself." The remarks sounded ordinary when spoken. They did not feel ordinary later. I decided to fill my bottle. Before I left, I asked if he needed water. He shook his head and told me I had already brought it. The answer landed with no clear meaning. I slung the strap over my shoulder and headed to the stream. The water was cold enough to ache my fingers, and bubbles climbed the inside of the bottle as it filled. The whole trip took half a minute, maybe a little more. I turned and climbed back up through the ferns toward the cedar. The place beside the tree was empty. The man was gone. The fire was gone. No stones remained. No ash. The cedar's bark showed no scrapes, scorch, or soot. I stood where the flame had been and waited for heat on my face. There was none. I held my palm a breath from the trunk, then pressed it flat. The bark was cold and rough. I crouched and worked my fingers through the duff, dry needles, an unopened cone. The smell of smoke thinned and then left the air entirely. My own tracks crossed the patchy ground in and out. I could not find any other prints. My guide sat up on his bedding and watched me walk back toward him with the bottle in my hand. I told him what I had seen. In order, I pointed to where the ring of stones had been, and gave the distance from our camp. I described the beadwork and the cut of the jacket. I said I had stepped away only long enough to fill water, and that the warmth from the first fire had still been on my skin. As I turned, he joined me at the cedar, set his palm against the trunk, and sifted the top layer of needles with slow, practiced motions. He checked for altered bark, pressed into the soil for any packed circle or disturbed edge that would mark a ring of stones. He found nothing. He said there was no warmth and no residue. We widened the search with a simple method. First a tight circle around the cedar, then out along the faint animal paths. We noted deer slots stitched across a soft patch and a fox's diagonal line. We found where our own steps had moved the damp leaves. There were no other human tracks. We broke to check our watches and agree on the time, since I first saw the fire, then continued to sweep until we reached the margin of the stream and the first stand beyond. The lack of marks held across the whole area. Back at camp, he lit our small stove. The burner's hiss sounded too bright in the quiet. We boiled water, and steam rose in pale lengths into the cold. We drank tea and set our gear in order. He said, as a simple rule, that not everything leaves a trace the ground can keep, and that sometimes a place refuses to hold what visits it. He told me that what remains is the talk and the way I move after it. We broke camp later in the morning. When we stepped onto the narrow path along the stream, I matched my stride to his. I watched his heel set and the roll of his weight, the way the toe lingered a fraction longer on a flat stone. My own steps found a cadence that held to it. The forest did not change, but my attention did. The cedar stood behind us in full daylight with plain bark and shadow. I knew where a fire had burned with intention, and where a man had sat and spoken to me. There was no heat, no ash, no stones, and no prints to prove it. I carried only the order of what happened, and the small adjustment in how my feet met the ground as we moved on. I didn't expect the gate to be chained. We picked the cemetery because it sits above the street with a view of downtown. It sounded private and reckless in a way that feels like confidence when you're 19. The iron bars wore a fat chain that hadn't been there last week. Rust colored the links. The padlock lay open on the bar like someone set it down mid-job and walked off. We climbed anyway. The gravel path popped under our shoes. Names on pale stones leaned in rows. The city noise fell thin behind the wall. The air dropped from humid to brittle in one breath. Warm on the inhale, winter on the exhale. I said I felt it. My companion hugged their arms and said we shouldn't be there. They framed it as a simple rule. Don't cross a boundary meant to keep you out, especially in a place set aside for the dead. I laughed once and heard how forced it sounded, then shut up. We moved along the path past a weeping angel with its nose rubbed smooth, and a square mausoleum with a family name cut deep above its sealed stone doors. Sound threaded into the cold. It wasn't shoes on gravel. It clicked quick and light like glass tapping stone, and it moved from the back fence toward us and then away again. My companion's hand found mine. Their skin felt hot compared to the air. I told myself it was small animals in the hedges. Then a white light slid across my peripheral vision. It wasn't a flashlight beam. It didn't throw shadows. It moved on its own. A translucent, fast smear shot along the back edge of the mausoleum and disappeared. The tapping tightened and braided around the path. The temperature bit down hard on my teeth. We both stopped without planning it. The light paused at the far corner for the space of a breath, and then cut behind the stone and out of sight. We turned for the gate. We walked fast, then faster. The street beyond framed up in the bars, headlights passing, a bus sighing, regular life in view. The chain sat where we'd left it, looped but loose, the open padlock resting against a bar. I reached to tilt it off the link. The lock body twitched, threaded itself through the chain, and closed. The shackle clicked home with a neat final sound. I looked for fishing line, hands in the hedges. A kid crouched behind the stone. Nothing moved. Only our faces reflected back, flat and dark in the iron. My companion said the rule again in different words. I didn't argue. The tapping started up behind us. It sounded closer. I scanned the path we'd just walked, and then the wall line to our left. There's a low stretch of wall at the back corner where the grade rises, and the fence fails to match it. We headed for it. The tapping stayed with our pace. At the Angel, it ran even with us. At the mausoleum, it seemed inside the stone. Another strip of white crossed at the edge of my vision, and snapped away. I took it as a warning to keep moving, and didn't test that thought with a stop. The back wall flaked chalk onto our palms when we grabbed it. The top edge was rough but climbable. I put one knee up, stood on the narrow ledge, and balanced with one foot still on cemetery side, and one in the alley air. A fast breath of colder air ran across the stones. I dropped to the other side. My companion came down beside me with a hard exhale that showed white. We didn't run. Running felt like it could turn a line we hadn't crossed into a chase. We walked fast down the dogleg of the alley until the cemetery wall broke behind garage roofs and porch lights. Wind chimes moved on a back deck. The air softened. The cold in my fingers loosened to normal. We stopped by a dumpster and let our breaths level. We both laughed once in that way you do when you clear a thing you can't name, and then we got quiet. I went back the next afternoon. Daylight, open gate. The chain was gone. The padlock was gone. The mausoleum stone looked ordinary up close, chipped in places, pitted by years. The Angel still had a rubbed nose. I stood at the threshold and said a plain apology into the shade under the trees. I didn't step in. That night before sleep, I closed my eyes and saw a strip of white cross from left to right and stopped short. It didn't light anything. It didn't throw a shadow. It just moved. I thought about the lock threading itself and the small, polite click when it seated. Not a slam, not a rattle, a closure that made the rule simple. Since then, I avoid short walls and half-open gaps at the edges of burial grounds. If a gate is closed, I treat it as closed. I don't argue with locks that work themselves. I don't pretend the cold was only weather. Unauthorized entry. Observation. A light that disappeared. A lock that clicked shut. I still don't know why it happened, only that we were noticed and then shown the boundary. And that was enough for me to leave it alone after dark. I had camped since I was little. My dad taught me to read clouds and trees the way other kids read street signs. By 16, I could set a tent in the dark and tell time by the night chorus at the lake. That night, the frogs were steady. The crickets filled the gaps, and water lapped against the cattails. My dog Scout lay with his head on my shin. The fire popped and sent a spark up. I had hung the cooking tools on the rack earlier, the ladle and tongs, the skillet on its hook. They clicked when the breeze moved them. The night felt full, and then it cut off. No frogs, no insects. Even the thin hiss above the water stopped at once. Scout lifted his head so fast the sleeping pads squeaked. His whole body locked. then began to shake. A growl worked in his throat, but he kept it under his breath, as if he understood that any sound would carry. I held still and listened to nothing. A mass slid into the camp by the cooking rack. I did not hear it arrive. It was there, taking up space where the firelight should have shown open ground. It moved between the rack and the ring of stones without a clink. The skillet hook swayed once and went still. I could not trace edges, only the height of a head set too high and shoulders that filled the gap between trees. With each step, a deep, steady pressure touched my chest and the floor of the tent. The dirt under me took it and passed it on. Between the rack and the tent there was a small rise, a packed shelf of root and hard earth about knee-high. It went down that drop in one smooth motion. No scrape, no breath. Anything large should make noise there. Deer caught branches. Bears pushed air. People muttered when they stumbled. This made no sound at all on contact, only that low internal beat I felt in my ribs. It turned toward the sleeping area. I had one thought about unzipping the tent and showing myself. Then I set my palm over Scout's muzzle and kept him quiet. His breath hammered against my hand. His eyes showed white. The tent wall in front of me darkened another shade as the bolt came alongside. The fabric did not move much, but the air cooled. My ears tightened as if the altitude had changed. A smell came up, clean and cold, like wet moss lifted from under a log and river stone, rinsed in spring water. It was not us, it was not the lake, it was not anything I had named here. I waited. It stopped beside the tent. I counted heartbeats because there was nothing else to count. The deep rhythm continued in the ground. Then it moved past. It left along a line that took it behind the tent and into the darker part of the trees. The gait stayed even and heavy, too regular for an animal that large to move so quietly. It did not fade. It withdrew until the pressure left my chest and the ground went slack beneath the pad. Sound returned in one abrupt lift. Frogs restarted, as if they had been held underwater. A cricket chirped and broke its pattern on the first try. The air warmed a little. Scout let out one thin whine and then breathed hard. I lifted my hand. He stayed pressed to me and shook in waves. I did not move for a long time. I watched the seam in the tent roof and kept inventory. Rope knots. Nylon damp from the lake air. A small plunk out on the water. The skillet hook no longer moving. When the light came up gray, mist hung low over the lake. Dew beaded on the guy lines. The ground in camp looked mostly untouched. If I had not watched the path it took, I would have missed the slight smooth run in the pine needles between the rack and the tent. The small shelf of roots bore no scuff. The skillet was on its hook, still and centered. Scout stuck so close I had to step around him to reach the pot. I cooked oatmeal and made coffee. The first spoon against the pot rattled in a way that felt too loud. I flinched. I packed methodically and checked each item back into its bag. I left earlier than planned and skipped the long loop by the cattails. On the trail out, my boots sounded big on the packed dirt, and Scout's tags jingled without apology. Back home, I said the trip was good. The fish were shy. The stars were clear. I did not mention that there are at least two kinds of silence in that forest, and one of them arrives before something large moves close enough to fog a tent wall with cold. I have gone back since. I still check weather and read sky, and count on the frogs to tell me the time. Some nights the air thickens and the chorus pauses, and my breath catches to match it. I mark that as a warning. I do not know what it means beyond approach and passage, only that once I saw a shape where there should have been open night, and it chose to keep going. I carry that now, the way I carry any earned habit from the woods. I listen for the cut, I feel for the pressure, and I keep my hand ready on the dog's muzzle when the world goes still. I moved into the neighborhood a week earlier and started taking my dog on the public trail that runs through the greenbelt behind the townhomes. Early morning was quiet and cold enough that my breath showed. A jogger in a reflective vest drifted into the trees. A mug clinked on a porch. It felt like the kind of place where a routine could stick. My dog, Rook, pulled ahead with his usual purpose, nose working through the juniper and ivy along the path. He is a steady dog. When he stopped, the stop had weight. We were rounding a wide sycamore with peeling pale bark when his hackles rose. He gave 3 sharp barks, not the kind he uses for play or greeting. I tightened the leash and looked into the ground cover around the tree. This strip of city woods holds raccoons and the occasional coyote. I planned to arc around and keep walking. A sound came from the far side of the sycamore. It was laughter, but not in a human register. Thin, high, regular enough to be a pattern. It came from low in the brush. I checked my pocket as if my phone had made it, then listened again. Rook's bark slid into a whine. He took 2 steps back. I crouched to bring the tangle of ivy and last year's leaves level with my eyes. Something moved fast under the leaves, quicker than a lizard. Then it stood. It was no taller than a small child, but it was not a child. The skin was a pale green, the kind that looked like the morning had soaked into it. The body was narrow. The limbs were too thin. It turned toward me. The eyes were round and steady. The mouth held a shape that read like a smile without landing. It shot forward through the shorn thistle stems, and stopped again. The laughter clipped and repeated. My mouth went dry. I held Rook's leash tighter and felt the pull in my fingers. Rook went first. He lunged hard away from the sycamore and the leash yanked my arm. I followed and ran. The brush behind us shook once and went still. I did not look back. We ran to the footbridge where the trail opened into brighter light and more space. I slowed because the ground widened under my shoes and because I could hear the ordinary noise of the street again. Someone's rake dragged on concrete. A jogger's steps passed on asphalt. Rook made a low sound and pressed against my leg. I put a hand on his neck. His fur vibrated under my palm. We stood there until our breathing evened enough to leave the trail. Back at the townhome, I locked the door and set water down for the dog. The coffee and utility list waited on the counter. He refused his food and lay on the kitchen rug facing the door. His ears ticked at small noises. I built explanations because that is what I do. A kid hiding in the brush, a prank, a recording, a bird doing something odd near a hollow trunk. Each answer covered one part and left a seam open. The leash burn on my hand stayed. In the afternoon, I tried to check the trail again. I clipped Rook's leash and walked him around the block. At the chain-link gate with the city rules sign, he stopped in place and would not step forward. He looked up at me. We turned. We finished the loop on sidewalks under trimmed trees and open sky. By the end of the week, that section of path was a gap in the map. If I had to be near it, I crossed the street. If someone asked, I said the dog did not like it there, and the brush should be cleared. That was true and easy to say. The sycamore stayed in my head anyway. Bright bark and green shade and ground cover that moved once and went quiet. On Sunday, a jogger paused near the mailboxes. He asked whether I used the trail much, and said he sometimes heard laughing down there in the mornings, never saw anyone, and then he kept going. That night, with the bedroom window open, I heard a thin sound from far off. It matched the rhythm I already knew. I closed the window and told myself it was the right move. Rook lifted his head to watch, and then set his chin back down. In the morning, we walked the long way around and stayed on the sidewalks. A boy rolled past on a scooter. A woman pulled a trash can to the curb. A crow worked through broken notes on a streetlight. At the end of the block, I could see the pale trunk of the sycamore. Through a tangle of branches, something green shifted and settled in that line of sight, the way light does when you finally look straight at it. We crossed to the other side and kept going without a glance back. I grew up 3 blocks from the old cemetery on the hill, with the iron gates that click when the wind shifts. Runners cut through it to save time. Wedding photos use the obelisks as backdrop. And on hot days, the perimeter wall stays cool. I passed it daily for years, and started noticing that it noticed me back. I cataloged small changes, a new chip and a slate marker, wrappers that gather under the hollies after Halloween, a colder pocket of air between 2 family plots. At first it felt like an exchange. I looked into the shade between mausoleums, and something held its place there until I moved on. At dusk, I used a straight shortcut from the north gate to the corner store lot. One evening, a shape the size of a truck stood between two monuments on the ridge. It wasn't smoke, it wasn't a tree. It removed light from itself and gave none back. Birds went silent. The pressure on my back matched the distance I had left to walk. I kept my pace and didn't change my line. Another day around noon, I cut past the soldiers section and saw a man in a long old coat and a too-tall hat beside a sunken stone. The daylight did nothing to thin him. He watched in a way that made me decide to keep moving. I did not break stride. I marked the position so I wouldn't wander that lane again by accident. Piers had their own crossings. Two friends ran through at night after a show and said two bright points chased them, moving fast and low, weaving at knee level across the path. No cars there, no handheld lights. They ran until the wall and only looked back once they reached the sidewalk. Later, I saw lights that did not belong to anyone. They zigzagged over the ground and tracked each other in tight loops, then slipped out against the boundary and were gone. The event that settled my rules came on a raw late winter evening, when the ground was thawing in hollows, and the air sat hard in the lungs. I have a habit of brushing my fingertips against one particular marker when I pass. The name is ordinary, but over time it became an anchor on that route. I reached for it as I always did. Before my hand touched stone, heat and anger rose through my arm and into my chest in a clear line. It stopped me. My fingers hovered an inch away and would not close the gap. The urge to withdraw was immediate and final. The space around that marker held firm against contact. I took my hand back and stepped away. After that, I changed how I crossed. I stopped returning attention. I picked paths that kept me out of sight lines. I avoided polished granite that would show anything but my own face. I rerouted around the ritual stone by a wide margin. When possible, I chose daytime, though the place keeps its own dim and bright. Ignoring wasn't denial. It was how I could keep living within walking distance without giving over my head to that ground. Years went by. I saw the massive shape again, pinned against a line of cedars like a storm that had not started. I saw the man in the coat a second time, patient as a posted guard. I saw the fast lights double and then split, and I watched them stop at the wall as if nothing past it could hold them. The pattern stayed consistent. When I noticed, they held their positions. When I kept my eyes on the path, the pressure eased. If someone asks whether that hill is haunted, I answer that it holds attention and gives it back with interest. My sensitivity made me a focus, and the refusal at the stone proved that not everything there is for me. That was enough to set my rules. Keep your head down. Do not reach for names. Take the clearest line and do not look into the shade between the mausoleums. The hill sits on the way to everything, so I still pass it. On some evenings, a river wind moves the gate, and it claps twice. The gravel answers with one quick rattle, and I keep walking without offering it any more of me than my steps. We left the playground in a truce that felt thin. I had accused my sister of cheating on the monkey bars, and the fight burned down to a quiet walk. The slide carried a last smear of light. The street lamps had not come on yet. Houses on our block were open to the air, and the smell of onions and something sweet drifted out as we cut toward home on the sidewalk. Two men stepped off the far curb near the stop sign. They wore matching dark suits and narrow ties, with dark glasses that didn't fit the fading light. They did not look at each other. Their line of travel matched ours. We kept our pace at first. Then we angled across the street. They crossed too, without breaking their stride. The space between us thinned. I told my sister we should keep moving. She nodded. Our shoes sounded loud on the concrete. Theirs made no sound at all. I suggested we speed up. We did. They adjusted by degrees, small changes that held a steady closing angle. When they were close enough that I expected the click of a heel or a scuff, there was nothing. Their arms barely swung. The glasses did not bounce. I decided to run. We ran. Our block stretched long in front of us. The two men shifted in one smooth move from walking to a light jog. They gained ground. We cut across our neighbor's lawn, breaking a house rule because the front steps were close and higher than the sidewalk. The sprinkler next door ticked through its arc. A raised slab where the maple roots had lifted the concrete came up fast, and we jumped it without looking down. The porch rose. I took the stairs two at a time and reached for the latch. My fingers slid once, then found it and pressed. My sister hit the door with the flat of her hand. Inside, air moved past my face from the hall, cool and carrying stew and dish soap. I looked back through the gap. The sidewalk was empty. The street held its evening color. The ticking sprinkler finished a cycle and stopped. No footsteps, no figures, no motion at all, at the corner or along the hedge. We stood inside and tried to explain it. Our mother listened while we washed our hands. She set plates out and asked if anyone had said anything to us. We told her they had not. She said that people could use sidewalks without it being about us. She reminded us to use the walkways and to stay off lawns. We sat at the table and ate. The house hummed in its usual way. The stew tasted like the onions we had smelled on the way home. The argument about the monkey bars turned into a short apology. After dinner, I stood at the front window with the lights off. The street lamp had come on and made a pale circle on the sidewalk. A moth thudded against the glass and slid down. The playground beyond the trees was a dark square. My sister came to stand beside me. We watched the corner where the men had first stepped off the curb. No one passed. The hedge across the street did not move. The stop sign showed its red face under the lamp. In bed, I went back over the order. We saw them. They matched our line. They closed the gap. We ran. They jogged and gained. We reached the door. The street was clear. Each step had a reason before the next one, and the switch to running felt automatic. The silence was the only part I could not fit. In the morning, we used the sidewalk on the way to school. The maple roots still pushed the concrete into the same humps. The stop sign held its spot at the corner. The lawn we had cut across showed no mark. There was no trace of the two men, only the way I watched the far curb and measured the angle of anyone who stepped off it, ready to run the moment a quiet set of steps started to gain on us. The voice in the water, the creek had taken everything. Daniel stood at the edge of what used to be his backyard, staring at the muddy scar that wound through the valley. 3 months had passed since the flood, but the land still looked broken. The garden was gone. The workshop was gone. Only concrete and twisted scrap remained. The creek that now slid by was narrow and shallow in the evening light. It had been a roaring channel when it rose. It had carried away houses and cars without care. Daniel had lost his home and business to that water. The insurance company fought him. The trailer was a box with thin walls. The contractors were unreliable. Some days he thought the water should have taken him too. This felt like one of those days. He had spent 14 hours hauling debris. Albums were pulp. Furniture was warped. Tools were rusted. Each piece was a small death. The full moon made the creek look pretty. That made him angry. He picked up a rock and threw it into the water. He threw another and cursed. A voice answered from the stream. He froze and looked around. The valley was empty. The voice came again and told him to stop. He asked who was there. There was only the creek sound. He reached for another rock. The voice returned, more insistent. It came from the water. It sounded real. He answered as if he spoke to another person. He asked who she was. She said she lived in the water. He asked to see her. The sound that followed could have been laughter, and could have been current. She told him to look where the water ran dark. He looked into a deep pool. The surface reflected the sky. As he watched, a face formed. It was a young woman's face with long dark hair that moved with the stream. Her eyes were the color of deep water. She smiled. He stepped back. The face giggled like spring bubbles. She offered to tell him a story. Daniel sat on a rock and watched the pool. Her voice came from the water and the air. She said she had many names. None of them truly hers. People called her the woman in the riffles. Some called her she at the bend. She had lived in this creek longer than his people had lived in these hills. She said she had once been flesh and blood. She lived in a village on this stream when the first families hunted and farmed here. Winter had been hard, game was scarce, children were hungry. The elders held a ceremony at the deep bend. They asked for mercy and life. She walked into the water and did not turn back. She felt her body slip away, and her spirit remain with the current. Daniel asked if the tribe survived. She said the spring came and the rains returned. People lived. New people came. Old houses fell, and new mills rose. She stayed with the water. Daniel asked why she had flooded them. She said she did not call the storm. She felt his grief in every drop that carried his life away. She carried it too. He said nothing helped. She told him he was not gone. He could build again. The water that took could also give. He looked at the valley. The damage remained. New green pushed up in places. Birds sang in the willows. He asked if he would see her again. She said she was always here. He should listen. He sat until dawn, while she told old stories of this bend, families planting, fishermen pulling traps, a child dropping a ring and laughing when it flashed in the shallows. He felt anger ease while she spoke. As the sun rose, her face faded. He picked up one last rock and did not throw it. He set it on the bank where it would not wash. Then he walked back to the trailer and began a list. At night, he sometimes heard the creek speaking in small sounds against stones. On hard mornings, he would go to the pool and look into the dark water. He did not always see a face. He always felt watched with a kind of care that did not belong to people. Night shift. So the restaurant on Market Street stayed busy until 10 most nights. By 11:30, the rush had faded to late workers and students. Sarah wiped down the prep counter and checked the rice warmers. 3 weeks of night shifts had left her wired at midnight and exhausted by dawn. Through the front windows, pedestrians moved along the sidewalk under amber lights. This part of downtown grew quiet after the bars closed. Sarah liked the way sound softened after midnight. She was refilling salsa when movement outside caught her eye. A tall woman walked past the window with a measured stride. The woman wore a pale green dress that looked expensive. Her hair was shoulder length and straight. It caught the streetlight in a strange way. The bell chimed. The woman entered. Up close, she looked even more striking. She stood at least 6 feet tall. She had a sculptural face and a steady gaze. Sarah greeted her and moved to the counter. The woman studied the menu boards. When she looked directly at Sarah, the lights seemed to flicker. Sarah could not tell if it was real. The woman asked for a bowl with rice and chicken. Sarah scooped rice. The woman's head tilted slightly as if she weighed each question. A low hum filled the space. It was barely audible at first. Sarah glanced around. Miguel washed dishes in the back. No one else was in the room. The hum grew louder. A tingling crawled along Sarah's arms and neck. The woman's eyes darkened until the pupils seemed to swallow the irises. The woman's face began to change. The skin texture shifted. Underlying bones seemed to move. The skin took on a smooth, glossy look like polished stone. The jaw extended in a way that was not human. Sarah tried to step back. Her muscles did not respond. The sound swelled and pressed inside her head. It felt like fingers sorting memory. The eyes were the worst. They turned completely dark and seemed to be windows without a back. The woman smiled. The teeth looked triangular and too many, like a predatory fish. Pain cut through Sarah's skull. Something forced contact inside her mind. It was not gentle. Thoughts tore. She felt an old self become thin. Images poured in. Vast rooms made of forms that hurt to see. Beings that moved along directions she did not know how to name. Distance and size that erased people. The presence felt amused and remote. It examined and dismissed her. It planted something in her mind. The contact broke. Sarah collapsed behind the counter. The woman's face returned. The hum faded. The light steadied. The woman asked for sour cream. Sarah's hand shook. She added sour cream. Blood ran from her nose. She finished the bowl in a daze and fought the urge to scream. The woman paid with exact change and took a seat. She ate with normal movements. She cleaned her table and left. Miguel came out and asked if she was okay. He said she looked pale and had blood on her face. She said she felt sick and left early. On the walk home, she scanned the shadows. She did not see the tall figure again. She did not need to. It was with her now. In the weeks that followed, Sarah felt changed. The thing it planted grew. She felt detached from routine. The mirror showed a face that looked like hers, and not makeup and effort hid what others did not seem to see. She fought urges she did not recognize. She stood in empty lots and listened to voices that did not carry through air. She learned to notice people who would hear more clearly than others. The night shift continued. Sarah worked with something else inside her. She began to understand there was a plan that moved slowly. It did not need anyone to notice it to succeed. Sometimes when the restaurant was empty and the street was quiet, she looked at her reflection in the dark window. For a second, the glass returned a face that was not entirely human. She turned away and finished the prep list. Tom Brennan had seen his share of bears in 23 years of hunting wilderness areas. He had tracked brown bears in remote peninsulas and watched grizzlies take salmon from bright water. Bears were part of the North, like long summer light and winter aurora. When Tom moved to eastern Kentucky for a forestry service job, he figured the dangerous wildlife was behind him. Kentucky had black bears, but they were smaller and avoided people. Hardwood ridges and clear streams felt tamer than the North. That changed on a cold December morning in his third year in Kentucky. He sat in a tree, stand on a ridge above a small valley with a spring-fed creek. The stand was 15 feet up, a massive oak. He had a clear view of trails. He had killed deer here before. It was quiet. He was thinking about climbing down when something moved below. The sound was heavier than deer. It pushed through brush without concern. He readied his bow and watched the edge of the clearing. What stepped out was neither bear nor hog. The creature stood upright, close to 7 feet, covered in dark hair streaked with pale patches. It was massive across the shoulders. Its arms hung low. The hands ended in thick, dark nails. The head sat on a neck so thick it merged with the shoulders. Tom's first thought was costume. Then he watched it move. The gait was powerful and balanced in a way no person could fake. It lowered its head to drink. Muscles shifted under the hair. The air carried a strong animal scent that was not like bear. It smelled like wet fur and something older. It straightened and scanned the valley. Its head turned slowly. Tom held still. He felt the gaze sweep his tree. It looked up at him. They locked eyes. The eyes were dark and assessing. The stare felt like a decision being made. After seconds that felt longer, it turned and walked away in silence. Tom stayed in the stand for an hour. When he climbed down, he found tracks by the creek. They were large and human-like in shape. 5 toes showed. The depth and spacing suggested weight and a long stride. He took photos and measured the prints against his boot in the frame for scale, without stating his boot size. He returned in the weeks after and saw the creature twice more, both at a distance. The second time he realized it followed the route he had taken in. It was learning him. The third time, he stood in a clearing 50 yards from it with only a knife on his belt. It watched him and raised one hand. The fingers were too long. He felt his thoughts slide into a place he did not like. The lips pulled back in a smile that showed serrated cusps that did not belong on an ape. It turned and slipped into the trees. He told his sister and her husband in spring and took them to the valley. An hour into the hike, his brother-in-law pointed toward pines on the far side of the creek. The creature stood among the trees. It watched them. It was not the white-furred figure that others had described in these hills. This one's hair was darker with pale streaks, tangled with bits of pine and leaf. It held itself differently. It was still impatient. They watched it. It turned and vanished. They returned several times and never saw it again. Tom found occasional tracks near the creek, and one blurred image on a trail camera that might have been it. Signs appeared near his house months later, footprints at the edge of the tree line, motion lights triggered with nothing visible under the beams. In the woods, he felt watched. He caught glimpses of dark hair slipping through brush, just at the edge of vision. He did not report it. He kept the secret and spoke about it only with people who had their own stories. Years later, he moved north again. The bears there seemed ordinary. On some winter nights, he woke with the sense of a presence outside the cabin. He lay still and listened until it passed. He did not check the window. In the morning, he sometimes found one oval patch of melted frost on the porch that looked like a bare place where something warm had stood and waited. The alarm clock read 3:15 when I shut it off, 2 minutes before it would have sounded. September mornings in the Pacific Northwest held a stillness that made you hear your own breath. I dressed in the dark and loaded the truck. The conference was in a mountain town. The ferry began its run at 6. Outside, the air was glassy. Gravel crunched. The woods behind the house rose in a wall of Douglas fir and cedar. I had lived on this land long enough to feel its rhythm. I lifted the tailgate and set my case in the bed. 50 yards of open grass stretched to the trees. 100 yards of dense forest dropped toward the bay. The sound came. It started low, then climbed and held. It lasted 5 or 6 seconds. It flowed like a voice. It stopped for a few beats and then repeated at exactly the same pitch and length. Dogs in every direction began barking. The chorus rolled across the neighborhood. One deep bay, several sharp yips, a few long howls from dogs I had never heard before. The sound of the morning changed. I stood with my laptop case in my hands and listened. The cry came from directly behind the house, close enough to reach in 2 minutes, close enough that whatever made it could see me. My first thought was clear. It was a primate. My second thought followed. There were no primates in those woods. I set the case down and walked back to the porch. The light cast a small circle. I turned it off. The dogs quieted one by one. Silence returned. I stood on the steps and waited. 15 minutes passed. The woods remained still. I finished loading and drove to the airport. The sound rode with me as a memory. I gave the presentation and came home a week later. The clearing felt like a different room in the same house. I listened differently. Small creaks carried weight. Branches that fell in the night made me stop and count heartbeats. On a clear October morning, I returned from the marsh with 2 roosters. I cleaned birds on a pine log 20 feet from the road. The septic tank lay somewhere under the grass nearby. Fee the dog lay by my feet and chewed a wing. I had just reached for the second bird when a fir 20 feet ahead began to sway. There was no wind. The other trees stood still. This trunk whipped side to side. Small limbs snapped and fell. Larger branches cracked and struck the ground. I stood with the knife in my hand and watched. The dog froze and then backed toward the house without a sound. He moved carefully and kept his eyes on the trees. The swaying ceased. 10 seconds passed. The sound of wood breaking resumed. It came as a series of sharp cracks, as if branches snapped across a knee. I gathered the birds and followed the dog to the steps. The knife felt like no help. By the time we reached the porch, the woods were quiet again. The broken branches lay in the grass. I felt watched, as if a line had been drawn. I cleaned the birds in the kitchen sink. That evening I called a colleague who had spent time with elders. I told him about the morning cry and the thrashing tree. He listened, and then said the old people had stories. They did not question whether such things existed. They learned to live alongside them. He said whatever it was it wanted me to know. He said backing away was wise. In the weeks that followed, I paid attention. Some places in the woods felt like rooms where someone else stood just out of view. New branches lay across a trail where none had been the day before. Low shrubs were bent and woven like a sign at knee height. I began to understand that I lived at the edge of two ways of knowing. The scientist in me wanted evidence. The person who had heard that voice knew evidence might not come on command. I stopped cleaning birds at the log by the trees. I did that work closer to the house. The morning I moved away, I stood at the clearing and looked toward the woods. The trees were dark silhouettes. I lifted my last box into the truck. A single knock sounded from the ravine. It echoed once from farther off and then went still. I closed the tailgate and drove to the ferry in the first light. Dr. Sarah Chen had built her career on evidence. 15 years of work had earned her tenure. Her walls held journals. Her computer held datasets and analysis. Her reputation rested on what could be replicated. When graduate student Todd brought cryptid encounter reports for his folklore thesis, Sarah read them as cultural material. They were useful for studying belief and story. Then she read the report from retired forest ranger William Hayes. It was different. It read like a professional incident report, with coordinates, weather, timestamps, and careful descriptions. Hayes wrote about tracking what he thought was an injured hiker and finding a bipedal creature in a clearing. He documented the encounter without dramatics. He included alternative explanations and his reasons for rejecting them. Marcus told her Hayes had died 3 years ago. He had found Hayes' supervisor, Janet Morrison. She said Hayes was the most reliable ranger she supervised. If he wrote it, he saw it. Sarah thought about the report for weeks. She had always worked from a materialist view. The report asked her to widen the frame. She read about traditional worldviews and how many cultures understand reality to include things science cannot yet measure. She asked if her framework had been too narrow. The question became personal in an old farmhouse in Appalachia, when she interviewed 87-year-old Edith Caldwell. They had talked about family history and old remedies. When Sarah asked about legends, Edith grew quiet and looked toward the trees. She said she had seen a wood booger. She had seen it many times in the same section of forest. Edith described a massive figure that watched. She first saw it when she was 12. It tilted its head. It smiled in a way that made her want to be sick. It returned over the decades. It never came close to the house. It watched from the edge of the trees. Sarah asked what Edith thought it was. Edith said some things had always lived here. People did not have to accept them for them to exist. On Sarah's last visit, Edith looked past her and went rigid. Sarah turned and saw a shape at the tree line. It stepped out. It stood near 8 feet tall and was covered in dark hair. Its face was almost human and wrong. Its eyes caught the last light. When it smiled, the teeth showed crowded and sharp. It raised a hand. The fingers were long. The steps toward the house shook floorboards. Pressure built behind Sarah's eyes as if something were testing a boundary. Edith pulled her to the back. They went down into the basement. The air smelled like earth. Above them, slow, heavy steps circled the house. Something breathed close to a window. 20 minutes passed before the sounds faded. They waited. When they came up, prints marked the earth, and claw marks scored window frames. Sarah drove back to her hotel shaking. The encounter had not asked for her belief. It had moved through her life without it. She incorporated the question into her classes. She did not tell the story. She asked if the scientific method was the only way to know a thing, and whether some phenomena sit where consciousness and culture blur measurement. Her paper on the subject drew praise and criticism. She was comfortable with both. She had learned that belief is shaped by experience as much as by data. Late at night, when the trees outside her windows shifted in the wind, Sarah sometimes saw the shape of a face where darkness was thickest. On those nights, she closed her laptop and turned off her desk lamp. She sat and listened to the house settle. She let the question hang in the room and did not try to answer it. Marcus had driven this stretch of desert highway through the tribal lands countless times, but never this late. The digital clock on his dashboard read 2:47 in the morning as he navigated the winding asphalt that cut through high desert country. He was returning from a camping trip with college friends near the ancient volcanic formation that rose like a cathedral from the mesa. The others had left that afternoon, but Marcus had stayed to watch the sunset paint the sandstone cliffs in shades of copper and gold. Now the landscape lay hidden beneath a moonless sky. His headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, lighting sagebrush and the occasional reflective eyes of jackrabbits that bounded across the road. The radio had lost signal 20 miles back. Only the tires and wind made sound. He thought about stories his friend David shared around the fire. David was from the local tribe, born and raised on the reservation, and he grew quiet when someone mentioned legends. "Some things you do not talk about," he had said, "especially not out here." Movement caught in the corner of Marcus's eye. A large coyote stood in the gravel shoulder, caught in the sweep of the headlights. It seemed bigger than any coyote he had seen. Its coat looked almost silver in the artificial light. Its eyes reflected with an intensity that made him slow. The coyote watched him pass. Marcus checked his mirror and saw it still standing, a dark shape against a sky full of stars. He pressed the accelerator. 5 minutes later, he saw it again. This time, the coyote ran alongside the road, keeping pace with the truck at 55. Marcus's pulse quickened. It moved with an effortless lope. The road curved and the lights brushed it. He pushed to 60, then 65. It kept pace. He gripped the wheel. Coyotes were fast, but not like this, and not for this long. He thought about a pack, or about depth and distance tricks in the dark. The highway dropped toward a wash. He lost sight of the animal and let his shoulders ease. The radio crackled with static. He reached to turn it off. When he looked back, the coyote stood in the center of the road. He braked hard. The truck slid to a stop 20 feet away. The animal did not move, and the harsh light details looked wrong. Legs too long, torso narrow, head too large. Ears sat in a way that looked familiar and not. The eyes were dark and aware. The creature began to change. It happened slowly at first. Limbs lengthened, spine shifted upright, fur thinned and slid away. The change looked like clay being reshaped. Within moments, a tall figure stood where the coyote had been. The figure was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long. Its joints bent slightly off the way human joints bend. The skin had a faint sheen. The face held both human and coyote elements in a way that fit neither. Marcus froze. The figure tilted its head and studied him. Then it smiled. The teeth were small and crowded, more than he expected, set too close together. The spell broke. Marcus threw the truck into reverse and floored it. Gravel clattered. He cranked the wheel, got it spun around, and shoved the shifter into drive. In the lights, he saw the figure walking toward him with long steps. He drove hard, the speed climbing past 70, and then 80. He did not check the mirrors. He did not slow until the first town's lights filled the windshield. He pulled into an all-night truck stop and sat shaking until sunrise. He never told anyone about it. When David called to ask about the drive, Marcus said it was uneventful. He chose a longer route for future trips to avoid that road. In the weeks that followed, Marcus sometimes woke before dawn, with the sense that something watched from the window. He lay still and listened to the city sounds until the feeling faded. He did not open the curtains to check. The memory of those dark, aware eyes stayed with him. He thought about David's words by the fire. Some things you do not talk about. When he passed that stretch of highway months later on a bright afternoon with friends, the truck's radio cut to static for 2 seconds and came back clean. He did not mention it. He just watched the road. Marcus had driven this stretch of desert highway through the tribal lands countless times, but never this late. The digital clock on his dashboard read 2:47 in the morning as he navigated the winding asphalt that cut through high desert country. He was returning from a camping trip with college friends near the ancient volcanic formation that rose like a cathedral from the mesa. The others had left that afternoon, but Marcus had stayed to watch the sunset paint the sandstone cliffs in shades of copper and gold. Now the landscape lay hidden beneath a moonless sky. His headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, lighting sagebrush and the occasional reflective eyes of jackrabbits that bounded across the road. The radio had lost signal 20 miles back. Only the tires and wind made sound. He thought about stories his friend David shared around the fire. David was from the local tribe, born and raised on the reservation, and he grew quiet when someone mentioned legends. Some things you do not talk about, he had said, especially not out here. 5 minutes later, he saw it again. The coyote watched him pass. Marcus checked his mirror and saw it still standing, a dark shape against a sky full of stars. He pressed the accelerator. Movement caught in the corner of Marcus's eye. A large coyote stood in the gravel shoulder, caught in the sweep of the headlights. It seemed bigger than any coyote he had seen. Its coat looked almost silver in the artificial light. Its eyes reflected with an intensity that made him slow. He gripped the wheel. Coyotes were fast, but not like this and not for this long. He thought about a pack, or about depth and distance tricks in the dark. The highway dropped toward a wash. He lost sight of the animal and let his shoulders ease. The radio crackled with static. He reached to turn it off. This time the coyote ran alongside the road, keeping pace with the truck at 55. Marcus's pulse quickened. It moved with an effortless lope. The road curved and the lights brushed it. He pushed to 60, then 65. It kept pace. When he looked back, the coyote stood in the center of the road. The eyes were dark and aware. He braked hard. The truck slid to a stop 20 feet away. The animal did not move. In the harsh light, details looked wrong. Legs too long, torso narrow, head too large. Ears sat in a way that looked familiar and not. The creature began to change. It happened slowly at first. Limbs lengthened, spine shifted upright, fur thinned and slid away. The change looked like clay, being reshaped. Within moments, a tall figure stood where the coyote had been. The figure was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long. Its joints bent slightly off the way human joints bend. The skin had a faint sheen. The face held both human and coyote elements in a way that fit neither. Marcus froze. The figure tilted its head and studied him. Then it smiled. The teeth were small and crowded, more than he expected, set too close together. The spell broke. Marcus threw the truck into reverse and floored it. Gravel clattered. He cranked the wheel, got it spun around, and shoved the shifter into drive. In the lights, he saw the figure walking toward him with long steps. He drove hard, the speed climbing past 70 and then 80. He did not check the mirrors. He did not slow until the first town's lights filled the windshield. He pulled into an all-night truck stop and sat shaking until sunrise. In the weeks that followed, Marcus sometimes woke before dawn with the sense that something watched from the window. He lay still and listened to the city sounds until the feeling faded. He did not open the curtains to check. He never told anyone about it. When David called to ask about the drive, Marcus said it was uneventful. He chose a longer route for future trips to avoid that road. The memory of those dark, aware eyes stayed with him. He thought about David's words by the fire. Some things you do not talk about. When he passed that stretch of highway months later on a bright afternoon with friends, the truck's radio cut to static for 2 seconds and came back clean. He did not mention it. He just watched the road. Todd had been hunting these mountain hills for 37 years, ever since his father first lifted him into the weathered oak stand overlooking the hollow. The same stand where he sat now, 20 feet above the forest floor, watching the pre-dawn darkness give way to gray. November had settled deep into the mountains. His breath hung in the air and every footstep cracked frozen leaves. The white-haired watcher. This morning felt different. The usual sounds seemed muted, as if the forest held its breath. The stand creaked as he shifted. A squirrel chattered to his left. A woodpecker worked dead timber in the distance. These were the sounds he knew. He had chosen this morning carefully. Clear skies, no wind. Trail cam photos showed a large buck moving just after sunrise. Todd had studied the images until he could see every tine in his mind. A twig snapped below. He turned slowly. A shape moved through the underbrush and paused in a small clearing 40 yards away. He checked his watch. 6:15. The sun would be up soon. The big deer would move along their routes. He had clear lanes in 3 directions and the wind in his favor. It was not a deer. The creature stood upright, near 7 feet, covered in long white hair that caught faint light. Its shoulders were broad. Its arms hung low. The face was not human and not animal. There was weight to the brow and strength in the jaw. It began walking toward his tree. Todd told himself it was a trick of light. Then it turned its head and looked up. He met its gaze through the scope. The eyes were dark and attentive. Todd's hand shook. He had faced bears and once a cat in these woods. Nothing felt like this. It stopped beneath his stand and looked up. Each step was deliberate. The white hair shifted with movement. Up close, it looked more like coarse fur. They stared at each other. Its nostrils flared as it took in his scent. Curiosity showed on its face, and something like recognition, as if it understood the man in the tree was part of the pattern here. It turned and walked away. He watched it disappear and found tracks later. They were large. 5 toes showed clearly. The stride was long. He told no one. 3 days later, he returned. Just after sunrise, the creature stood at the edge of the clearing and watched him from 60 yards. It did not approach. It turned and vanished into the trees. Todd raised his binoculars. The white-furred creature stood just inside the trees by a large oak. Tom whispered a question that had no answer. The third time, a week later, his sister Sarah and her husband Tom were with him. They sat in a different stand. Sarah pointed toward the meadow and asked if that was a deer. The creature stepped out, revealed its height and bulk, then turned and slipped away. They sat stunned. Tom said they should call someone. Tom shook his head. No one would believe it. Sarah said they had all seen it. It was not a bear. In the weeks after, Todd returned but did not see it again. He heard distant sounds at night that might have been it calling to others, but he could not be sure. Todd never saw it again. On quiet mornings when mist lay low, he sometimes felt a gaze from the shadows. When he left apples by a stump for deer, one autumn, he found the fruit gone but the skins left in a neat pile. He smiled and said nothing. Winter came early. Todd put away his gear. In spring, he watched the woods without a rifle and understood something he had missed. This was not only an animal, it felt old. The white coat might be age. It had watched him as much as he had watched it. The theft in the pines. He field-dressed the deer quickly and tied bright tape to a branch to mark the spot. He went for the rope and tarp. Brad had been hunting these woods for 37 years, long enough to know the difference between what belonged and what did not. The morning he lost his deer to something that should not exist started like any other November dawn, with frost silvering the pine needles and his breath forming small clouds in the still air. He had tracked the 8-point buck since before sunrise, following its trail through sweet gum and dogwood beneath towering loblolly pines. The shot was clean. The animal dropped at the edge of a small clearing, about 200 yards from the old logging road. Drag marks led away. They were wide and deep, like something larger than a deer had been pulled. Brad followed the trail toward thicker pines, where the canopy dimmed the morning. When he returned 20 minutes later, the deer was gone. He assumed he got turned around. The pines could be disorienting. He searched until he found the tape. The clearing was empty. Blood stained the leaves where the deer had fallen. His hunting partner called his name from behind. The man had been a mile away. In still air, the sound carried. Brad called back. They met at the drag line. Claw marks gouged tree trunks higher than any man could reach. Sap still wept from fresh cuts. The pattern looked deliberate, not random territorial scratching. The woods had gone quiet. No birds, no wind. His heartbeat sounded loud. His partner stopped suddenly and pointed up. They followed the trail through massive trunks and patches of brush. The marks remained too wide and too deep. Brad considered black bears and dismissed them. The deer hung from a loblolly nearly 60 feet up. The body swayed lightly. The lowest branches on that tree started well above the ground. Brad stared. The base of the trunk showed deep gouges, spaced far apart, as if something climbed straight up. The cuts were sharp. The smell hit them, thick and musky. They stood for a long time. A breeze turned the carcass and showed the bullet hole. It was his deer. His partner whispered and asked how it got there. They backed out of the pines and moved quickly to the trucks. The drag line felt like a path laid for them. The thought curdled in his gut. Something moved above the suspended body. Brad saw dark fur and heavy limbs in the canopy. It melted back into shade. His partner gripped Brad's arm and said they needed to leave. Brad agreed without looking away. That night he told his wife he missed the shot. It was easier to say. At the truck, his partner asked if he would hunt there again. Brad looked at the dark tops of the trees and said he did not know. He already knew he would not. He read stories of game found in impossible places. He slept poorly. He checked locks and added lights. 3 weeks later, his partner drove back and called with an update. The deer was gone. The claw marks remained. New gouges appeared on other trees at the same height. Whatever used that grove still worked there. Brad hunted elsewhere, sometimes passing the old logging road. He slowed and looked toward the pines. The canopy concealed everything. He pressed the accelerator and listened for a sound that had begun to haunt him. In quiet moments, he thought he heard claws rab softly on bark far away, a steady scrape like breath. Todd had been hunting these mountain hills for 37 years, ever since his father first lifted him into the weathered oak stand overlooking the hollow. The same stand where he sat now, 20 feet above the forest floor, watching the pre-dawn darkness give way to gray. November had settled deep into the mountains. His breath hung in the air, and every footstep cracked frozen leaves. He had chosen this morning carefully. Clear skies, no wind. Trail cam photos showed a large buck moving just after sunrise. Todd had studied the images until he could see every tine in his mind. The stand creaked as he shifted. A squirrel chattered to his left. A woodpecker worked dead timber in the distance. These were the sounds he knew. This morning felt different. The usual sound seemed muted, as if the forest held its breath. He checked his watch. 6:15. The sun would be up soon. The big deer would move along their routes. He had clear lanes in 3 directions and the wind in his favor. A twig snapped below. He turned slowly. A shape moved through the underbrush and paused in a small clearing, 40 yards away. It was not a deer. The creature stood upright near 7 feet, covered in long white hair that caught faint light. Its shoulders were broad. Its arms hung low. The face was not human and not animal. There was weight to the brow and strength in the jaw. Todd told himself it was a trick of light. Then it turned its head and looked up. He met its gaze through the scope. The eyes were dark and attentive. It began walking toward his tree. Each step was deliberate. The white hair shifted with movement. Up close it looked more like coarse fur. Todd's hand shook. He had faced bears and once a cat in these woods. Nothing felt like this. It stopped beneath his stand and looked up. They stared at each other. Its nostrils flared as it took in his scent. Curiosity showed on its face, and something like recognition, as if it understood the man in the tree was part of the pattern here. It turned and walked away. He watched it disappear and found tracks later. They were large. 5 toes showed clearly. The stride was long. He told no one. 3 days later he returned. Just after sunrise, the creature stood at the edge of the clearing and watched him from 60 yards. It did not approach. It turned and vanished into the trees. The third time, a week later, his sister Sarah and her husband Tom were with him. They sat in a different stand. Sarah pointed toward the meadow and asked if that was a deer. Todd raised his binoculars. The white-furred creature stood just inside the trees by a large oak. Tom whispered a question that had no answer. The creature stepped out, revealed its height and bulk, then turned and slipped away. They sat stunned. Tom said they should call someone. Todd shook his head. No one would believe it. Sarah said they had all seen it. It was not a bear. In the weeks after, Todd returned but did not see it again. He heard distant sounds at night that might have been it calling to others, but he could not be sure. Winter came early. Todd put away his gear. In spring, he watched the woods without a rifle and understood something he had missed. This was not only an animal, it felt old. The white coat might be age. It had watched him as much as he had watched it. Todd never saw it again. On quiet mornings when mist lay low, he sometimes felt a gaze from the shadows. When he left apples by a stump for deer one autumn, he found the fruit gone, but the skins left in a neat pile. He smiled and said nothing. Danny Whitaker had been born and raised in the hills of eastern Kentucky, where the mountains rolled toward the horizon and every hollow held old stories. He learned the language of the woods. He could tell a screech owl from a bobcat and could hear the difference between a startled deer and a distressed one. When Danny heard voices calling from the hollow that October night, he knew they did not belong to any creature he knew. The hollow got its name from a mining accident in 1952, when a shaft collapse killed 7 men who were never recovered. Families moved away. The forest grew back. Locals avoided the place because there was nothing there to visit. Danny tracked a wounded black bear into the area. A car had hit it on the highway. The wildlife department wanted the carcass found before it drew scavengers to the road. He followed the blood trail through oak and hickory. He passed rusting mining equipment under kudzu. The light was that particular late October light that makes leaves glow. He heard the first voice ahead of him. It was human in tone and wrong in meaning. The sounds had rhythm and cadence without words he knew. Another voice answered from a different direction. Then another. The hollow held a conversation in a language just beyond understanding. He stopped and listened. The voices were not coyotes or wildcats. They came from throats. The forest's evening chorus had fallen silent. The wind had stilled. The conversation stopped. The silence was complete. He heard his heart. He wanted to leave. He also wanted to know. He followed the blood trail, now moving more carefully. He passed into a grove of old hemlocks. The air under them was cool and still. He found the bear at the base of a large tree. It had been dead for hours. The body had been moved, not by scavengers. It lay on its back with legs arranged symmetrically. Its head faced the canopy. The ground around it had been cleared in a rough circle. Symbols were scratched in the dirt. The lines looked too regular to be chance. He took photos. The voices started again, closer now on the ridge above the grove. The sound grew rhythmic. It became a chant. The syllables nearly formed patterns he felt but could not parse. Something large moved in the trees above him. Branches creaked. Leaves rustled. Shadows passed. He could not see forms clearly. He felt watched from several points. The chant reached a peak and stopped. The movement in the canopy shifted away. The sounds receded. The woods returned to ordinary evening. Danny waited a few minutes. He finished his photographs and hiked out. The walk took forever. Every shadow held possibility. No voices returned. He reached his truck at last light. At home, he studied the images. The arrangement did not look like random disturbance. The symbols were too regular. He had heard stories all his life. He knew the Cherokee once lived in these hills. He knew what elders said about places where things were thin. He had dismissed most of it as story, but the grove shifted something in him. He returned to the hollow in the weeks that followed. He did not hear the voices again. He found more markings. He saw stones placed in patterns. He saw bark peeled in lines. He read about the area's past. The hollow had been considered sacred. Mining had covered older sites and cut through places used for ceremony. The more he learned, the more the hemlock grove made sense to him. The voices were not speaking a modern tongue. They might be echoing something older. He did not report any of it. He visited respectfully and finished his wildlife work. When others later told their own stories about the hollow, he listened and nodded. On some evenings when the wind held still, Danny heard a faint carrying of sound down the ridge. It was not words. It was the rise and fall of speech. He stood and listened until it faded, then walked home quietly,